Okay, let's make it on. Well, actually, can Divya move around? Yeah. Okay. Are we ready now? She said we're ready? Okay.
Stay in front of the screen. So go get these.
Wait, it's better in front of us.
Just in this area.
Okay. Okay, so this is the refugee Is this okay? Yeah. No, he wants you closer.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah, all right.
You see it?
Okay,
You see
that's
it?
right there. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, the refugee experience. Yes.
Hi everyone, my name is Divya Mishra, and I'm from Johns Hopkins University. And first of all, I want to thank Pulitzer for supporting this project. So my project is on unaccompanied refugee minors' transition to adulthood in Greece. And I became interested in this topic because I used to volunteer as an interpreter for unaccompanied minors on the island of Lesbos in Greece back in 2016. And now it is also the topic of my doctoral dissertation, so I've been talking about it a lot. So first of all, I want to begin with who these unaccompanied minors are. Back in 2016, over 5,000 of them entered Greece. And although the numbers have dropped somewhat, they're still coming. As of this year, they've had about 3,000 more unaccompanied minors enter Greece. And over 90% of them are boys, and more than half of them are 17 years old. And this is really important because this means they're on the border of being classified as unaccompanied minors, which from a humanitarian perspective is seen as a very vulnerable group and is targeted for a lot of assistance. And they're about to be classified as single adult males, which again, from a humanitarian perspective, is not seen as very vulnerable at all, and they have very limited access to aid once they turn 18. So when most people think about the refugee crisis in Greece, they think about Syrians, and for good reason, because the largest group of refugees in Greece is from Syria. However, when you're talking about unaccompanied minors, the demographics change. The two largest groups are from Pakistan and Afghanistan, and Afghans actually make up the largest group of unaccompanied minors in all of Europe. By the time these minors arrive in Greece, they've already undergone a lot of mental distress. Conditions like depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder are very common among this population. Often this is because of traumatic experiences they've had in their home countries before they've left. And also it's attributed to the journeys they take to come to Europe. So these minors, they often leave from Afghanistan or Pakistan, and they're transported across Iran by smugglers, very much like cargo. And then they cross the mountainous border between Iran and Turkey right here on foot through the snow. And then they are again transported across Turkey, and they make their way to Greece, either over the land border in the north, or on boats to the eastern Aegean Islands, which is the route we most commonly hear about in the media. This journey was described very, very well by Arsalan, who is a 19-year-old Pakistani, and this is very much how many of the minors I talked to described it. He said, "I left home, and the journey of death began. Over mountains, over rivers, over the sea. The agents, which is what they call the smugglers, said they would drive us in a car, but we were in the trunk of a car for 2 hours, 3 hours, and once for 24 hours. We were 3 boys in the trunk." Once these minors arrive in Greece, because they're underage, they have access to child protection programs and shelters that are supposed to keep them safe from abuse and exploitation. These are temporary shelters, and often during their time in Greece, these minors are transferred from one shelter to another. Now, one would imagine that from a mental health perspective, these shelters are a good thing, especially after the difficult journeys that many of these young men have made. However, during the course of my reporting, I found that the experiences that these boys have while living in child protection programs contributes significantly to the mental distress that they have. And for the rest of this presentation, I want to focus on the story of Gazim Hosseini, a 19-year-old Afghan boy who came to the island of Lesbos in 2016. Gazim describes the first house he was placed in, the first shelter he was placed in Lesbos. It was run by an organization called Laktida, which is a Greek organization and also an official UNICEF partner for child protection. This was a house in the city of Mytilene, outside the camp, Moria, on the island. He describes feeling like the environment inside of the house was very chaotic, and he describes feeling unsafe. Even though he was in the company of child protection workers, he felt like they were very disengaged from the challenges that he and many of the other boys there living there were facing. Some of the boys had been living in the house for more than a year, he says. Some for even 2 years. They tried to commit suicide, they had fights with each other. House managers came and asked questions like, "Why did you do this?" They all knew the reason, because it wasn't just one boy, it was many boys. Another young man who wished to remain unnamed also lived in one of the houses run by Laktida in Lesbos in 2016. He showed me these marks on his arms and said, "These marks are from Moria. The kids often did things like this. There were even kids who tried to cut their throats so that the authorities would take them out of there." And although I saw, there were many of the boys I talked to, and I talked to 44 of them over the last 4 months in Greece, many of them had arm marks like this on their arms or other places, although most of them didn't want to talk about it. In a few months, Gazim was then transferred to a shelter in central Athens. It was a hotel turned into a shelter for unaccompanied minors, and it was run by the International Organization for Migration. Gazim says that in the city, challenges like violence within the shelters and instances of self-harm decreased because there were more things to do, there were more ways to get out of there, they didn't feel so trapped. However, the city brought with itself new challenges. Many of these hotel-turned shelters were in poor neighborhoods where the sex trade and the drug trade took place right outside their doorsteps. The situation for minors is so bad here, Gazim says, that in the evenings, the minors have to become sex workers. When the boys go outside, they don't have money to smoke or buy anything that they fancy. And then keep in mind, these are teenage boys in the city. They are going to want to buy things. The government and the NGOs only provide accommodations and food, not money. So because of this reason, they have to do this work, he says. The challenges that Gazim faced moving through the shelter systems in Greece can be attributed to the approach that child protection programs in Greece are currently taking. Dr. Vasilia Dejadiki from the Harvard Center for Health and Human Rights, who led a study on unaccompanied minors exploitation in Greece, criticizes this approach, saying, "What is happening here in Greece is that organizations and service providers focus mostly on the basic needs of children, shelter, food, and medical care provision. However, we tend to ignore the agency of these children, their wishes and their desires. For that reason, the interventions that we employ are not successful." And for me, this quote really encapsulated why, despite living in child protection systems, in shelters that were supposed to keep him safe, Gazim and others like him still encountered so much isolation, and they felt so unsafe. Despite the challenges that he faced, Gazim was determined to build a meaningful life in Greece. He'd gotten asylum in Greece, which meant he expected to stay there. With the help of some of his Afghan friends, he found Greek lessons designed specifically for Farsi speakers like him, taught by a Greek woman who promised if you came every single day, including Saturdays and Sundays, in 8 months you would be fluent in Greek. And Gazim was determined to learn. The camp, oh, there was a map here. Okay, I'm sorry. So the classes that Gazim went to were in Shisto refugee camp, which is 17 miles from the center of Athens where he lives, 17 kilometers. It was far, but it was an hour bus ride and still connected by city transport. And he made that trip every single day to go to his lessons. However, soon after starting these lessons, Gazim turned 18. 2 days after his 18th birthday, he was told by the International Organization of Migration, by the house managers where he lived, that he would be moved to Tiva refugee camp, which was over 90 kilometers away from Athens. And it was in a small town, away from NGOs, away from humanitarian organizations, where he wouldn't have had access to Greek lessons or many of the other services he relied on in the city. Gazim begged his advisors to stay there. However, he was told, no, this is a decision for you, and you will have to go. The boys who went with me, he says, they can now speak Greek. He now lives in Tiva camp, which is an old clothing factory far away, with very little access to services. I think it's important to listen to stories like Gazim's, as many of the initiatives that we do to protect children may actually not be doing them very much good at all. That's it.
Hi, my name is Ani. I go to Washington University in St. Louis. Just a disclaimer, this is my first time doing anything related to journalism. I have a pre-med background, but having gone through this exercise about how you tell stories rather than just state facts, which is what I'm used to in reading clinical medicine, etc., has been an interesting exercise. And I think that's really important as a doctor, that you know someday you know how to communicate these types of issues in a way they care. So I reported on the resettlement of Bhutanese refugees in central Massachusetts. I think one of the few people, or only person who was focusing within the United States.
Puerto Rico, yeah.
Puerto Rico, sorry. And a really interesting topic, because about 4 months ago, I didn't know that A, there were Bhutanese refugees, and B, that a lot of them were in the United States. I got interested in this topic through a colleague of mine who works at Harvard Medical School, and asked me to do some reporting on this, because it's not really talked about that often. So I just wanted to go over some brief background. So as I said, the population I was focusing on is Bhutan. If you look at the bottom right, it's a tiny country sandwiched between India and China. And actually, this refugee crisis is considered one of the most protracted, neglected crises in the world. Evidenced by the fact that just a lot of people don't know about it. When you think refugees, obviously Syria, other parts of the Middle East, and the Rohingya. Yeah, so that's one reason why I took it over. So just some brief historical background. The population I was focusing on was one ethnic group within Bhutan that has Nepali ancestry. And so a lot of them, which had Nepali ancestry, moved to Bhutan in the 1980s. And like many other refugee crises, the government was not a fan of it, and found it a threat that they were getting influence and popularity within the country. So they implemented what was called a One Nation, One People policy, which exiled over 100,000 people. And by doing that, they stripped people of citizenship, they took people's land away, they imprisoned people, tortured people, set fire to property, banned the learning of Nepali language in school, etc. So a lot of Nepali people had to flee. They first went to India and to find resettlement there, but were turned away at the border because India didn't have the infrastructure and the willpower to take them. So they went back to Nepal, where about from 1980 to the early 2000s, where many of them stayed. The conditions there were pretty tough, given mass migration. So already in the camps, with issues like PTSD, depression, anxiety, were all rampant in the camp. So already difficult situation there. The Obama administration, about in 2008, took a lot of leadership in resettling these refugees, and over 85% are actually settled in the United States. While my focus area was in central Massachusetts, in areas called Worcester and Shrewsbury, the largest populations are actually in New York, Indiana, North Carolina, Texas. As I said, my focus of fieldwork was in Shrewsbury and Worcester, which are two kind of small cities, nothing like living in a big city, located in central Massachusetts, about 40 miles southwest of Boston. So it's like living in a very suburban area. So very different environment than what it's like to live in a big city, which I found interesting. And what I was really interested in looking at was if there was a so-called, if it was better for refugees from Bhutan to be resettled in an urban area like Boston, or in a more suburban area like Worcester. And I'll define what better means as I go forward. And so I spoke to like about 4 different people, a mixture of refugees, social workers, academics. The most important one was the first one, Mr. Purna Nepan, who himself was a refugee who came in 2008 and landed in Worcester around then. He's played a pivotal role in helping refugees in Worcester, not just Bhutanese, but in the population there are also other refugees, people from Rwanda and other parts of the Middle East as well. So he's played a really pivotal role in helping people integrate in Worcester. He founded what's called ARISE, Advocacy of Refugee and Immigrant Services for Empowerment, which is this nonprofit that's providing housing, language, and healthcare support for people there. And he speaks English, so he was like my gateway into the community. Obviously, having not been in the population before and not being a refugee myself, getting access to the perspectives I got required a gatekeeper, someone who knew the people and could speak the language. So that was really helpful. I also spoke to another refugee, Divya Mishra, who also provided some other type of insight. And Dr. Rajram Gautam was a professor of social gerontology at the University of Massachusetts and really provided me with a lot of the history and context which I just went over. And Dr. Sanjita Pradhan was a former director of refugee resettlement for Catholic Services. So a really good mixture of people. So I'm going to talk about 2 different things, both which one in terms of urban or rural was better, but also another issue that I came across, which is I can't really talk, which I must talk about if I'm going to do justice to this issue. So I originally was going to report on actually the really high suicide rates that are seen nationally among Bhutanese refugees. So there's a lot of interesting academic literature about high suicide rates among Bhutanese refugees. It's about double the national average, and I was wanting to report on that originally, but given my lack of knowledge about the issue and lack of insight and language issues and the sensitivity, of course, I switched my topic. But I wanted to talk about it because it still is it's a major issue, and it really framed issue came up during a lot of my discussions and it framed a lot of my interactions. And what you found was while healthcare and access to healthcare was difficult, English as a major barrier for speaking the language for all types of people created many issues. So without having the ability to speak English, doctors and clinics couldn't probably communicate with patients. I talked to one woman who, because the translator in the clinic and the doctor didn't have time, was prescribed the wrong course of medication, which led to further complications down the road. The main group of people I spoke to were older people, so adults and grandparents. But also there's a big generation gap between adults and their children because children can't speak Nepali and parents can't speak English. So that also exacerbates a lot of mental health issues and conditions. And so I really found it interesting at English being a major barrier for speaking the language and the downstream effects it had. I found that was very interesting. So what I decided to do is I decided to make that the topic of my thesis, which I'm currently writing over the next year. But in terms of what I actually reported on and actually primarily looked at, there was really no one set consensus of whether it was better to go in Worcester, resettle in Worcester and Shrewsbury, or resettle in Boston. And so different factors that you had to consider were access to jobs, safety, transportation, and healthcare resources. In terms of healthcare resources themselves, both Worcester and Shrewsbury and Boston, after talking to Purna Nepan, told me that the infrastructure is there. There are hospitals in both areas. And that's not necessarily an issue regarding the presence of hospitals. It's the social infrastructure within the hospitals and the healthcare system there that really defines a lot of issues there. And so there really was no difference between urban and rural in that regard, but because there was issues within the infrastructure and system itself regards to that. When it came to access to jobs and public safety, though, things varied. So Nupan told me that living in Boston would be better for access to jobs for 2 reasons. Obviously, Boston is a very big hub for healthcare tech. And has a lot of financial firms there as well. So naturally, you would think that living in Boston, in an urban area, you could find people who get access to entry-level jobs and find your way to support yourself. Additionally, because Boston has such an effective transportation system, getting to and from work would be very efficient and helpful. So that was the answer I got from him. When I talked to Divya Mishra, he gave me a different perspective. He said that in Worcester, it was much better simply because there was more space. The families could live closer together, families could live closer together and much more space and a lot more personal comfortability with the environment. Another thing that I found that was interesting is that in Bhutan, families all live together. Grandparents, kids, uncles, aunts all live together. So any one household will have about 15 people at any given time. And in that maintaining that social structure is really critical for personal well-being in the United States. But what I found is that social infrastructure is breaking in places like Boston, where you don't have big houses and suburban-like houses where you can support that volume of people. However, in Worcester, because it's much more spaced out, houses are much bigger, that type of close-knit sense can be maintained, and that has a huge impact on personal well-being. Additionally, in Worcester, because there's a lot more space and it's a lot more open, people can farm, they can garden, they can grow their own fruits and vegetables, which is a really key component of life back in Bhutan. When it came to public safety, I got different mixtures as well. Nupan told me that in Boston, because there are more people, streets are more well lit, better transportation, and accountability, that you'd be more safe there. But Mishra told me that because there are fewer people in Worcester, fewer interactions, more higher levels of safety. So ultimately, I found that it came down to preference of the individual, which I thought was interesting. So it's really hard for me to say that there's no one better place. But one thing that was clear as I was coming out and as I conclude was that people are very hopeful there. We talked about this. So a lot of people there actually do want to contribute, and if you talk to them, will say that life here is better than what it was back in Nepal. And a lot of people do want to help learn English and support themselves and gain access to a new life in the United States. And I think that's very impressive given all that they've been through. Thank you.
Okay, my name's Caron Creighton, and I'm a student at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. I spent about 3 months in Israel over the summer, working as an intern for the Associated Press and also reporting this story, which was eventually published in the AP, which was really lucky to get that to work out. So this is an image from a protest outside of the Foreign Ministry in Jerusalem in June. There were a lot of Eritrean asylum seekers protesting their ambassador to Israel, saying that he didn't represent their interest because he was a supporter of the government they had left in Eritrea. And this is just one of many images. But so to kind of sum it up, there are about 35,000 asylum seekers from a few African countries in Israel. Immigration kind of started in the early 2000s and then peaked in the mid-2000s, but stopped around 2012 when Israel built a new fence to keep people from coming. So why do people leave Eritrea? There are a number of reasons. First of all, they have a dictatorship. Their president has been in power since about 1993. That's about 25 years. There's also compulsory military conscription that basically lasts your whole life. So a lot of people flee that. And there's been an ongoing war with Ethiopia, which technically ended over the summer. There's a peace agreement, which I'll get to later. But so many issues, people leave. This is a photo from a barber shop in South Tel Aviv, which is where a lot of Eritrean asylum seekers live in Israel. I took a lot of photos of workers when I was there because I wanted to show, for my larger project, kind of where people work. A lot of people work in low-wage jobs. They work for only cash. These guys only worked for cash in this barber shop. A lot of people work in restaurants. They clean private homes. So they don't make a ton of money. And the point of telling you that is the story, their legal status is confusing. They do get papers when they come because they're applying for asylum, but it says that they technically can't work. It's very confusing, but I mean, everyone is working. A lot of people do work legally. So basically, they're confused, aid workers are confused, I'm confused. Yeah. Oh crap, what did I get?
Did we try going backwards?
I think I accidentally hit one of these bottom buttons.
Here's it.
Okay, so this photo is from inside an Eritrean-run pizza shop in South Tel Aviv. And this kind of leads into my story focused on this thing called the deposit law. It takes 20% out of the salaries of asylum seekers and holds it in a fund that they can't access until they voluntarily leave Israel. I guess the point is, Israel can't legally deport people because they're applying for asylum and they can't go back to their countries because technically it's too hard. It's another kind of confusing situation. Israel has tried many different ways to get people to leave voluntarily. Last year there was a policy to offer people $3,500 and a plane ticket to go to Uganda or Rwanda just to get people to voluntarily leave. So this is another tactic that they're using, taking money from their salaries, holding it in a fund that they say, you can get this money back when you choose to leave. But no one really wants to leave because a lot of people have been here for about 10 years, kind of built their lives, they have kids. So to kind of highlight some of the points of the deposit law, it takes 20% out, plus an additional 16% from their pension fund, and it also discourages Israeli employers from hiring asylum seekers by charging them an additional tax. So there are a lot of things that already take away from their pretty low salaries that people have. So problematic. Through a lot of my research and talking to aid workers, I wanted to figure out if this is something that's ever happened in another country. And from what I learned, I think this is pretty unprecedented. It doesn't seem like there are any other countries that are taxing asylum seekers and taking money from them. Seems pretty unique. There's also a lot of kind of really negative rhetoric in Israel around these asylum seekers. They call them infiltrators, which is inherently kind of a really tough term to deal with. So the impact of the deposit law is mainly what my story focused on. It mainly impacts single mothers, of which there are many in the Eritrean asylum seeker community. A lot of people have to give up health care for their kids. They place their kids in unsafe daycares where in previous years children had even died. They have to move into smaller apartments, share with other families. They have to work longer hours, of course. And all of this is while people are living in an already pretty poor neighborhood in South Tel Aviv. So the original residents of South Tel Aviv are pretty unhappy to have more poor people there, bringing down the neighborhood even more. So there's a lot of racism, many issues. These numbers, I feel, are important because it shows how much Israel is trying to push these people out. Israel has accepted less than 1% of all asylum applications. Out of about 14,000 asylum applications, they have accepted 10. And for Eritreans in Europe, they have a pretty high refugee recognition rate. They're second only to Syrian refugees as far as being recognized and given refugee status. So 92% refugee recognition rate, which I think kind of shows they have a pretty good claim for asylum, but they're just not getting it. So if Israel is so awful, why do they go there? This map kind of shows some of the different routes that Eritrean asylum seekers take. A lot of people go through Libya, which, I mean, Libya's pretty awful. There's no real government there after the loss of Gaddafi. There's ISIS. People have been sold into slavery. I mean, asylum seekers that I talked to showed me photos of their friends who had just been beaten in the street when they're in Libya. So a lot of people don't really want to go there. But if you make it through all of those awful things, then you can get on a small boat and try to cross into Italy. A lot of people are waiting in boats. There's so much talk of European countries rejecting asylum seekers who come in boats now. I think just under 2,000 people have died on the Mediterranean this year. That's people crossing overall, not just Eritreans. So there are a lot of reasons why you wouldn't want to take this route. Israel seems like a much better option when you consider all those terrible things. So I just wanted to close up with a couple photos of some people that I met while I was there. This is Haben. He's 28. He works in a restaurant. He came to Israel in 2006, and he was incredibly helpful for me when I was doing my reporting. I met him through a mutual friend, and he introduced me to all of the people that I photographed working at work, and helped me get a lot of contacts. And he He said that he doesn't want to leave Israel. He feels like his only option would be to go back to Eritrea. So it feels a bit like he said he felt like he was living in a prison because he had no other options and places to go. But to end on a slightly higher note, this is Meskina, and I met him in July, and he and his family were living, he had 4 children and his wife, and they were living in a 1-bedroom apartment in South Tel Aviv. But at the end of July, they were relocated to Canada and now live in Toronto because they were given refugee status, where many people from Eritrea are trying to go. And that's all I got.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Now, I think you're supposed to be in front of the
We'll
screen.
go over here.
A little bit more.
Good afternoon. My name is Thea Piltzecker. It's my partner, Liz Scherffius, and our film is called A Table for All. I've lost my voice a little bit this morning, so if I'm a little hoarse, I apologize. Liz and I met in the Columbia Journalism documentary program. We had both reported internationally and domestically on immigration and refugee issues ourselves in previous years. And so we really wanted to make a film together about refugee issues in New York. We were particularly upset by the journalistic dialogue about refugees at this time period. This was in about 2016, 2017 when we began making the film. The conversation around refugees really seemed to be centering on a lot of very negative things. I'm sure we've all seen this coverage. And there wasn't very much focus on something that I thought was really essential, which is after people have gone on the boats that we've heard about, after they've gotten to the country, what happens next? If they find a place to live, how do they begin their new lives? So we were really interested in the idea of resettlement and on assimilation. And we wanted to address that. We sort of had to begin finding a spot to figure that out. Normally, when we talk about our project, we have to begin by giving some context about who's a refugee, who's an asylee, who's a displaced person, where are all these people coming from, giving you a bunch of numbers. Luckily, I know you all are a very informed audience. We have the privilege of being in front of folks who actually know what we're talking about. So I'm going to kind of skip the numbers game for now and just give you a preview. I hope that you've had a chance to take a look at our film. We sent out a link. You guys are welcome to watch it after our presentation too. But we're gonna play the trailer for you now so you can see. If I can get this to work, we'll see. Jen, how do I? This should just play, no?
Yes, it should. We have the
I'm so
video.
sorry. I just
Clip.
clicked it.
We're learning more about President Trump's executive order.
A total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
Refugees are welcome here, no hate, no fear.
I had no idea you spoke Spanish. Thank you. All we need is somebody to speak Russian and Amharic and Arabic. Somebody learn Russian.
That a lot of our students are hearing so much anti-immigrant, anti-refugee rhetoric. No, we really want you here, and we want what you bring to the table. For our culinary program, we're looking for people with a passion for cooking.
So it's like 3 or 4.
It really just depends on the size of the onion.
Yeah, I will do it now, but I'm not sure.
Make sure you're not cutting your fingers, right?
Yeah, my eyes hurt. I really want to be a businesswoman and open my restaurant or a cafe.
Audra?
It's shame if everyone know that we escaped, me and my sister, my dad or my brothers or my uncles. Of course they will call us.
Every day I call my wife, I talk to her and my daughter about my life in this country.
As a dishwasher, it's the worst job in the kitchen.
In 1 year, I speak well English. It's my goal.
For many of our students, this is by no means the hardest thing that they've had to endure. This is just one step closer to reclaiming their lives.
If our eyes were eyes together. Don't worry about me. Don't worry about me.
So yeah, that was our trailer. We felt very fortunate to have met Carrie, who, it was kind of a coincidence, fate, I guess. She was beginning the program when we needed to begin our filming for our thesis. So that first scene in the trailer was when they were moving into their first restaurant location. And they're getting it all set up and such. So this is the pop-up that Carrie began. This image here on the upper left, that's in Red Hook. And it has a really lovely view from the subway station of the Statue of Liberty, which is actually where the name Emma's Torch comes from. It's in reference to Emma Lazarus, who wrote the New Colossus, which is on the pedestal. And it was actually used to raise money for the statue to come over. This is the pop-up. Here's Boubacar and Adwa, who are our central characters of our film. Boubacar is from Guinea and Adwa is from Saudi Arabia. They both, they're both asylees, both fleeing violence. Boubacar's case is political persecution. Adwa is gender-based violence, and her sister was actually LGBTQ. So they both left in different yet similar circumstances and were really eager to become chefs and reinvent themselves. Neither of them had cooked before. It's a 5-week program. We followed them from day one. Actually, Carrie we followed from before day one and like the beginning of a restaurant, which she had never run a restaurant before also. So it's going through her experience also of fundraising and bringing in the first customers, and it was exciting. It was really exciting to be in the kitchen with them with the camera and following it all. So, and that's Carrie in the middle, as you all saw. So they go through this 5-week program. This is the graduation dinner up on top. We won't give too much of the film away in case you all want to see it. But everyone goes through the program. They become certified chefs. Everyone's doing very well. Adwa was actually featured in the New York Times, and Carrie has gotten a lot of press attention. She's been covered by everyone for Emma's Torch and expanded into a new restaurant space, a larger space, which is their own in Carroll Gardens in Brooklyn. And here's the graduation dinner at the bottom as well. So we just felt really fortunate to have met these wonderful people who are trying to better themselves and their families and create a new life in the United States. Despite a lot of the rhetoric and the current political climate, they were really people who continue to believe in the American dream, which is in question, I guess. What is the American dream? But they had this very specific idea that if you work hard enough and go into everything with good intentions, then you could achieve something. I think that they may feel like that they've achieved their own version of that. So it was really, it was a positive thing to be witness to.
And just a few issues, because we have talked about this in a few of the other presentations. We had some concerns about safety for our subjects, safety and anonymity. Obviously, because our subjects were asylees, some of them were victims of human trafficking. They were very uncomfortable initially with our presence and with our filming, as we've discussed earlier this morning and yesterday. Filmmaking especially can be a very invasive project. And so we had to spend a lot of time just hanging out in the restaurant and really and in the restaurant, on the bus, on the subway, in the library, all over New York with all of these people. We traveled to, I think, all boroughs except for Staten Island. Sorry, Staten Island. I should get there to work on this film. And I think that kind of commitment is something that we have done in our other national reporting and international reporting. So it was really nice to be able to do it in my hometown, to have that kind of focus, and to earn the trust of people who had been through so much already, and who really risked their lives to speak with us to a certain extent. Adwa and her sister had said that if anyone, as you heard, if anyone knew that where they were and it could locate them, they were still in danger. Their lives were still in danger. And so we had to be very careful over the process of our reporting and our filming with them to not reveal anything about their specific location. We are incredibly grateful to the Pulitzer Center, to Kim and John, and of course to Linda Winslow. I don't see Linda here right now, but I know that she's probably watching. Linda, thank you for financing my Columbia education. Thank you for financing this. I would not be here without you in many regards, and I am really very grateful to you and to the whole Pulitzer Center. That's about all we have to say, I think, right?
Yeah, we have a few more slides. So this was DACA. The film is finished, and with support of the Pulitzer Center, we were able to get it into good editing shape. And I guess we're out of time, but yes, thank you, Pulitzer Center, and yeah.
No, you can't sit down here.
Oh,
we definitely
yes.
do want to join us. Yeah, because we are done.
Okay.
Yes. So just make sure your mics are on, not muted. Yes, good.
Hi, Isabella Palma from Northwestern University in Qatar. My question is for Caron. Sorry, I'll let you settle down. So you mentioned how they were kind of ostracized in a way, but you didn't really talk about Palestinians in Israel. So I wanted to know if you kind of found out what they felt towards the Eritrean group in Israel, if they joined forces or if it was just an individual kind of like fight against the Israeli government.
Yeah, I thought about this before I started reporting, a little bit during. I didn't actually end up asking anyone about it, but that's because the impression I got was really that there are two very separate fights. I think the Palestinians don't really know about the Eritreans from what I got, and the Eritreans, I don't know if they probably know about the Palestinians, but they don't really interact with them. They're very separate. I mean, Tel Aviv, like distance-wise, is far, and I think a lot of people are just kind of stuck in their own struggle.
Julia from William & Mary. My question is more for, I guess, Dan, Liz, and Ani as well. When you guys were working in both New York and in Worcester, did you find that an issue of communities that people were were sort of moving into, and the communities that they existed in within the U.S., how that affected not assimilation, but their involvement in either their communities or a lack of involvement in that sort of way?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. We spoke to a lot of folks before we chose our two main characters, and this was an issue for many of them. I'm thinking in particular of Sasha. There's a big Russian population in Coney Island, and so we actually there were a few Russian asylees in the program who had been fleeing Russia because of LGBTQ persecution. And when they came to New York, they had initially thought, gee, we can move to Coney Island. There are lots of Russian speakers here. We can move to Brighton Beach. They got there, and they were really not welcome, and they felt a lot of the same persecution on a social level, if not a political level, that they would face in Russia. So there was a certain sense of isolation among many of the people that we had spoken to, and that goes for actually a lot of the LGBTQ populations that we had looked at. I think the Saudi sisters that we mentioned felt much the same way about the Saudi population. They hadn't really had any interaction. They'd moved to a separate location. They hadn't had much interaction with the Saudi, or really very much the Arabic-speaking population at all. I think there was a real concentration in their case on moving as far away as possible. So that was good and bad in their case, I think.
Going off that, I forgot to mention this, but one of the individuals with whom I spoke had said that a lot of refugees back in Bhutan or from Bhutan had images of America, big houses, place full of opportunity, and a really place where you can make yourself. But upon coming here, as I had mentioned, traditional lifestyles like farming and everyone in the family doing things together has really eroded away in the United States. which has definitely affected assimilation. Obviously, you can't, by living in Worcester, which is more spacious and more suburban, access to the same type of crops, a daily schedule where you can do that is much more different. Here, people have to spend time looking for jobs, regardless of what they are, learn English, and provide for their children. So it definitely there has been some discrepancies in assimilation because of preconceived notions.
Tomas from Forsyth Tech. My question goes to Caron. Did you notice any indication of corruption within the deposit law?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I forgot to mention that. I think, let me gather my thoughts for a second. So a lot of people were concerned, a lot of Eritrean people were concerned about where their money was going. But I think the process is still so complicated and so removed, and frankly, people are just so busy because they're working such long hours that a lot of people can't check whether or not their money is actually being deposited. There were a few cases that were mentioned of employers pocketing the money for themselves. But it's really hard for asylum seekers to know where that's going, and frankly, a lot of people don't know how to check whether or not their fund is actually, actually the money is going into their fund.
Hi, Amanda from Westchester Community College again. My question is for the unaccompanied minors in Greece. I noticed that from the pictures, I only saw male figures. Is it a mostly male thing to travel, or did you see any women?
So it is over 90% male, and especially in a place like Afghanistan, it's common for if families are unsafe, they often get their daughters married somewhere else within Afghanistan and send their sons out, and I think that's due to the nature of the violence that happens in Afghanistan. Like if you are a man and if you're out and about, you're much more likely to be either targeted for something you're doing or just be in harm's way. Whereas if you're a woman and you stay indoors, you're not in the same kind of danger. And because of that, even when whole families are displaced, the daughters aren't typically the ones who are sent out. So like it happens. I heard of 1 or 2 Afghan females in Greece while I was there, but even many of the organizations who work with them had not met any women in these countries. From Africa, it's a different story, but from the Asian countries, it's primarily male.
Thank you. Joy?
Hi, this question's for Caron. Joy from Spelman College. Yes. How do you think Eritrean migration to Israel will change, if it will change, with the new peace accords with Ethiopia?
That's such a big question. I wish I knew. I don't know. I think a lot of people were very skeptical about the peace agreement that I spoke to. It seems like Israel is trying to use this as another reason to push people back to Eritrea. They're saying, now there won't be lifelong military conscription because there's not a war between Ethiopia anymore. But I mean, frankly, it's way too soon to say that. I don't think that no Eritrean people that I spoke with seem to think that anything would really change in their country because of this peace agreement. So I don't think they're really itching to go back. But whether or not they'll be forced to go back because of it, it's hard to say.
Hi, I'm Julia from Georgetown University, and this goes for both Divya and Caron. I was wondering what kind of activism, if any, you saw from within Greece and Israel of Greek citizens or Israeli citizens who were really demonstrating on behalf of these migrants and refugees.
I thank you for mentioning that because it's something that I forgot to mention. I wanted to say, there are so many Israeli people that do care about these refugees, and I think that's something that needs to be emphasized because the government is in a lot of ways separate from its own citizens. There was a lot of activism, especially on the side of Israelis. So many Eritrean people that I spoke to were really grateful to the Israelis who had helped them, and I think that's an important thing to mention.
I can't say if I've seen as much activism as I should have. I saw a lot more on the islands when I was there a couple of years ago, but not so much in Athens, and that doesn't mean it's not there at all. It just means, I didn't come across it. What I did see was from many Greek citizens, like a lot of grassroots efforts to help not only unaccompanied minors, but a lot of the homeless populations, including like the young single adult males who are refugees, that many of the bigger humanitarian organizations often neglect because they focus on traditionally vulnerable populations like single women, children, families. So the single males, which what many of the 18-year-olds former unaccompanied minors were, they often did rely on like grassroots Greek organizations that didn't pick and choose who they served.
Hello, I'm Alexa Smith from City Colleges of Chicago, and my question is for
seeing how little services there are for asylees who are recently arrived, have recently arrived to the United States, was eye-opening to me. A lot of the burden falls on smaller organizations, but a lot of people are not brought into these organizations as well, and have to figure it out on their own. So, yeah, I mean, seeing that, learning more about how the U.S. asylum system works, but then also being exposed to a program like Carrie's and others as well who have really committed themselves to providing that first initial step and getting people on their feet. So.
Thank you all very much.